Uh, Joe, it's great to speak with you again.
Yeah, great to talk to you too, Suzanne.
So I want to begin at the very beginning, which is your inspiration for writing this book. Your background, of course, is in science. You have a PhD in genetics. You worked at Nature. There is no more hard science publication than that. And yet, when we spoke months ago, you told me that you came to this topic from a very kind of personal place, and I wondered if you'd just say more about that.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of things that brought me to this topic. But yeah, as you say, I have a very scientific background. I've always been quite a black and white reductionist scientific person. I want to see the evidence. I want to know what the trials are for something. I want to know how things work. Um, but when it comes to the effect of the mind on the body, I just felt that the science or reading science articles or books wasn't necessarily giving me all the answers that I wanted. So I have two kids in school now and mixing with mums in the school playground. You know, a lot of them are into alternative medicine and they really feel that it's helping them. And I didn't feel that that could just be dismissed. You know, often it's said that people who think that alternative medicine works for them are somehow ignorant or stupid, they're being fooled,
Hmm.
and that just doesn't make sense to me. You know, you have a lot of intelligent, educated people who feel that it's helping them in some way. So that made me really intrigued to find out what's really going on there. I think also because the debate about the role of the mind in health is so polarized. So we all know from experience that our mental state affects the physical body. You know, you just step out in front of a car and you feel your heart suddenly race.
Hmm.
But when it comes to whether that's important for health, all the answers seem to be at one end of the spectrum or the other. You know, you have some claims being made for kind of miracle cures. You know, you can find books arguing that the mind can heal pretty much anything. If you
Hmm.
just think positively enough. On the other
Yeah.
hand, you have the skeptics saying the whole thing's deluded, dangerous quackery. So again, that intrigued me. Why do we find it so hard to have a rational debate about this? And I wanted to know if you could take a middle road and find out what the
Hmm.
science really says about this.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it occurs to me that even the very vocabulary around this topic is adversarial in a sense. The very term alternative medicine, complementary medicine, integrative medicine, mind body medicine. It's each one of those terms in its way implies an opposite. If something's alternative, for example, it's against the mainstream, which indeed it historically is. And I wonder if you have a sense historically, since I know you're also a medical historian, really, in addition to being a science writer, of how this divide came to be, when in fact the certainly the origins of medicine in ancient times and beyond very much appreciated the relationship between mind and body. When did the divide happen?
I'm sure the actual answer to that question is a very complicated one, but to really simplify it, I think if you go back to Descartes in the 17th century, where he was dividing the universe, matter, into two kinds of things, if you like. You had physical, measurable objects, including the body, which was a valid topic for scientific inquiry, and then you had the sort of ephemeral soul or spirit, you know, this subjective emotions, beliefs,
Mhm.
which couldn't be measured, couldn't be studied scientifically, and that split, that mind body split today, doesn't really hold water. You'd be hard pushed to find a neuroscientist who really thinks that the mind and the brain are split in that way. But I think there's a hangover from that a lot of scientists now feel that um, the mind, subjective things, kind of are less scientific and less valid for
Mhm.
scientific inquiry than sort of objective, measurable things. And you know, this idea that anything to do with the mind over body must be sort of flaky. You know, there's a real
Mhm.
prejudice against those kinds of studies, and I think that's still, yeah, definitely holds today. A lot of the researchers I spoke to when writing the book felt that they had been worried for their reputations to even address these topics. And I think that's really concerning, where you have areas that you can't even, that you're not even, questions you're not even supposed to ask in science. For me, that's not a very scientific approach.
Hmm. Yeah, and of course that that divide goes the other way as well. I mean, it's just speaking as someone who practices primary care, internal medicine, that there's a suspicion among many patients who are devotees of alternative or complementary medicine that there are certain things that traditional medicine can't possibly understand, that must be wrong about, must even in fact have some nefarious intent about. I think the argument over vaccination, for example, is is very, very adversarial and fueled by a lot of bad feeling on both sides. I guess what I wanted to ask you about next relates to that, which is that on the one hand, particularly fueled by the internet, you have sort of a lot of dividing of these two camps, and yet at the same time, as you talk about in your book, more and more we're seeing scientific study of alternative treatments and embracing of alternative approaches within the traditional medical community. So I guess that was a long-winded run-up to asking you whether you see the rift starting to maybe narrow at this point.
Yeah, so first of all, something I just wanted to agree with something that you said in that, which was that absolutely there's the other side to this, where there are people more on the alternative side who it's almost like we don't need a scientific approach because they know the mind can do all of these things. And I think that's a real problem as well. And I think that both the skeptics and the believers, if you like, are they kind of both have the same view of the mind as some mysterious magical force that sort of
Mm-hmm.
doesn't obey normal rules and can't be studied, and
Mm-hmm.
that leads the believers to think that the mind can do anything, has no limits, and the skeptics to think that the mind couldn't possibly do anything. And so I think what they've both got wrong is that the mind isn't a mysterious magical force. It's biology. It's something that we can study
Mm-hmm.
scientifically. It does affect the body, but it does it through very well defined pathways and mechanisms that we can study. So I just wanted to say that first of all.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of whether that rift is healing, I hope so to a certain extent. What makes me positive is largely advances in neuroscience, because now with brain scans it's possible to see, or to physically measure, if you like, changes in the brain that are associated with changes in mental state. So in terms of studies of the placebo effect, for example, researchers can physically see that endorphins are being released when people respond to a placebo painkiller, for example. They can see that dopamine is being released in Parkinson's patients who respond to placebo. So actually being able to see and measure these things, as opposed to just relying on patient self-report, goes a long way towards making all this seem more scientific, to persuading people that they should take it
Uh-huh.
seriously. The same with
Uh-huh.
studies of meditation as well. You've got brain scans showing sort of changes in the physical structure of the brain after people do short courses of, say, mindfulness meditation. So from that point of view, I feel very positive that we've now got really good tools for studying these kinds of things in a scientific way. What On the negative side, I think there are a lot of political, sort of cultural, economic obstacles to this approach becoming more widespread, because the whole way that clinical trials are set up, for example, where we test new drugs against placebo to make sure that that it's the drug that's working and not the placebo effect, that's really important. We need to know what's the active biochemical effect of the drug and what's placebo. But the way that the trials are set up is we test for the active biochemical effect of the drug and we just throw everything else away. By definition, anything that happens in the placebo group is not of interest. Anything that's no better than placebo is thrown away. Whereas what's really in the placebo group is everything about the patient, their attitude to their condition,
Hmm.
the medical care that they're receiving, the words that are used by the practitioners, the beliefs and expectations, all of that, everything about medical care apart from the biochemical effects of the drug is in that placebo group, and we're throwing it away at the moment. And you've also got the fact that most clinical trials are funded by drug companies, for example. So I think that we need a lot of fundamental changes in how we approach trial design, who funds that research, and in these prejudices that I talked about among a lot of conventional scientists and doctors. So yeah, there are some interesting new tools coming about, but there's also a long way to go.
Yeah, yeah. So it seems like a good time to just talk about the concept of placebo itself, which is very much, I think, central to mind-body medicine. And yet, as you point out, I think most people think of placebo as sort of a nothing, as an absence of a something,
Mm.
when in fact it's a measurable and very real effect. I think, in medicine, if we were to say to a patient, and this of course comes up a lot, oh, well, I know you felt better when you had antibiotics for your cold, but that's just placebo. And it feels dismissive, and it feels like you're negating what's a real phenomenon. I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about placebo and particularly about the fascinating research you talk about, some conducted here in Boston, about open trials of placebo where people know they're taking a, say, sugar pill, so to speak, and they still have therapeutic benefit. What's that all about? It's surprising. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? And that's just something that's coming out in the last few years that surprised a lot of people. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. People tend to think of placebos, yeah, as a kind of a negative, a nothing. If somebody gets better after receiving a fake treatment, then presumably they just would have got better anyway, or maybe they just think that they're better and nothing's really changed. Maybe they're saying they feel better just to please the experimenter. But what several decades worth of research is showing now is that there are real measurable biological changes that are very similar to the changes that are caused by drugs. So in pain, for example, where placebo effects are very strong, when people respond to a placebo painkiller, there are several different pathways. But one of them is, for example, a release of endorphins in the brain. And opioid painkillers like morphine work by binding to endorphin receptors in the brain. So it's pretty much the same biochemical pathway, that belief of having received a painkiller or the painkiller itself. Placebo effects can differ a lot. The proportion of people that respond to placebo in trials can vary from 0 to 100%, depending on the circumstances. The same placebo can have positive, negative, or neutral effects that varies in different countries. Different kinds of therapy or treatment trigger different sizes of placebo effect. And so at first sight, that seems really odd. It's kind of slippery. It sort of adds to this idea of placebo as something sort of a bit mysterious, a bit flaky. But actually, researchers like Ted Kapchuk at Harvard, for example, who work on placebos, say that that's because we've got our understanding of placebos all wrong. It's a placebo effect has nothing to do really with the placebo. I mean, as we know, there's nothing in that. It's inert. It can't do anything by definition. What triggers the effect is our psychological response to that treatment, what that treatment means to us. And that, of
Hmm.
course, can differ very substantially between different people, different circumstances. For example, there's a quite commonly cited case where red or pink pills tend to trigger particularly large placebo effects for pain, whereas blue pills they have a more calming effect. They're better for sleep,
Hmm.
except among Italian men. And the researchers who did that trial think that it's because blue is the colour of their national football team. So they would find blue exciting and arousing rather than calming. So I just
Uh-huh.
used that example to show that it's not anything inherent in the placebo, it's what that means to the individual person. And yes, what's really exciting or interesting now is that there are trials in several conditions. The first was in irritable bowel syndrome in 2010, but since then trials in ADHD, in migraine, in depression, showing that you can take a placebo, know it's a placebo, and it still works. And yeah, there are several possible reasons for that that we can talk about if you like.
Mhm. Um, yeah, before we do though, I find that I want to mention that a placebo isn't only a pill. A placebo can be a situation, a tone of voice, a phone call. I can't tell you the number of times I call a patient and they say, I feel so much better, and you sense that something more is going on than simply that, they heard words from me that they may have heard from me before, or uh, that there's something just sort of active, dynamic about being called by your doctor. Um, but it kind of intersects with a great interest of mine, which is the role of story in medicine and narrative. And it so much of medicine, certainly psychiatry, is around retelling a story in a way that feels healing. And I think, in a sense, that is also placebo, not just the sugar pill that you're told is going to help you, but sort of a reframing of the mind in such a way that the body actually feels better.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, there are lots of ways of defining placebo and placebo effects, but
Hmm.
certainly there are so many factors that feed into why people have these biological changes when they receive placebos. There are some quite interesting studies, again, coming out of Harvard, where they're trying to tease apart different ingredients. So there's one in patients with irritable bowel syndrome, um, who either had no treatment or who had sham or placebo acupuncture. And then the
Hmm.
ones who had the placebo acupuncture, the practitioner was either cold but polite.
Hmm.
And that significantly, those patients who got that sham acupuncture did significantly better than the ones who got no treatment. And then there was
Hmm.
another group who had exactly the same sham acupuncture, but the practitioner was warm and empathic and asked
Uh-huh.
them lots of personal questions, had thoughtful silences, touched them on the arm, and they
Hmm.
did much better still. They did as well in that group as in any trial of a drug for irritable bowel syndrome.
Uh-huh.
Um, so
Yeah.
I was just going to say that the needles did something. There was a placebo effect there, but just the attitude, that interaction with the practitioner, then helped even more. So there's different. They were sort of teasing out the different components, and I think that's really interesting, and that helps us to see how we might be able to incorporate some of those components of care back into conventional medicine in an evidence-based way.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it reminds me of the fascinating program that you mentioned in the book. I believe also based in Boston, where anesthesiologists speak to patients in a particular way that's calming and that seems to reduce the pain and trauma of breast biopsies. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, this is really striking results. So they're looking at invasive medical procedures. So there's an
Mhm.
increasing number of procedures now that we go through and we're conscious. So you can have sedative drugs, local anaesthetic, but you're aware for the procedure. So things like keyhole surgery, yeah, breast biopsies, destruction of tumours, and generally people are given sedative drugs on demand. But these
Mhm.
researchers sort of tried to take a more psychological approach. So that was that they had a control group, drugs on demand, and the patient's pain and anxiety, if you ask them, just rises through the procedure. The longer it goes on, the more pain they're in, the more anxious they get. And then there was a group where the medical staff tried to communicate more positively, so they just avoided negative mentions of sort of how much things were about to hurt, and they
Mhm.
tried to respond to patients' requests swiftly, tried to make them feel in control. And for them, pain and anxiety stayed roughly level, so they did significantly better. And then in the third group, they got both of those things, but then they also were encouraged to use visualization techniques to relax. So
Mhm.
imagining themselves somewhere they'd rather be, like on a beach or their sofa at home. And in that
Mhm.
group, pain and anxiety actually fell through the procedure. They required only half the amount of sedative drugs. Their procedures went more smoothly and were over more quickly, and they had significantly fewer complications as
Mhm.
well. And yeah, you could argue that that's all sort of elements of the placebo effect, really, that were enabling lower drug doses to be used. And the patients didn't just find that, the procedure more pleasant, they actually had better physical outcomes as well because of it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I can't resist, mentioning one of my own sort of personal
Sure.
crusades, which has to do with the increased requirements of physicians to be tapping away at a computer while a patient is in the room. That's becoming more and more commonplace. And, the arguments against it for, those of us who resist it are that, well, first of all, it just simply seems rude, and that, somehow it's not good for the relationship not to be making eye to eye contact. But listening to you reinforces my feeling that we're losing some of our healing capacity, the sort of, if you will, the placebo component of what we bring to the interaction by not actually speaking directly to patients and engaging them. I know perhaps I'm particularly sensitive, but when I've gone to doctors who aren't looking at me, um, I find it very anxiety provoking, and I find that I start sort of losing confidence, and I start, feeling that I'm not going to get better.
Mm.
So I wonder if that's the placebo argument is one that we can make in this very uphill battle to prevent the computer from being so intrusive in the room. Um, you know, I getting back to the idea of the narrowing gap between traditional and alternative medicine, what I find, certainly in my hospital, is that the department that's most receptive to alternative treatment is oncology. That cancer patients are offered massage and Reiki and acupuncture, and these treatments are actually, in the electronic medical record in a way that you don't see with other specialties, including my own primary care. I refer people to these practitioners, but they're external to my department and even to my hospital. And I wonder if you've noticed that and why you think that might be.
Yeah, I have noticed that. I think you're right. I don't really know why it is. I mean, certainly patients undergoing chemotherapy are going to have a lot of symptoms. They're going to be in pain anyway, and then fatigue, nausea. So a lot of these chronic symptoms that they're dealing with that conventional medicine is not very good at helping people with, and alternative medicine often is quite good at helping people with. So I don't know if it's just that or whether there's a different attitude in that particular field. What does make me a bit nervous about this is in terms of referring patients to alternative medicine, is I don't want to lose that scientific approach, and often these therapies are given by people who are like the therapists are offering explanations for their treatments that really don't make any sense from a scientific point of view. So from looking at all of the research, I'm quite convinced that these treatments are going to help people, and perhaps help people more than, say, conventional painkillers in some cases. And there was quite an interesting trial in more than 1,000 patients with chronic low back pain, where there was no difference between acupuncture and placebo acupuncture, but both groups did nearly twice as well as the patients who got conventional medicine, including the painkillers. So this argument that just because something is no better than placebo, it's worthless, I think doesn't hold water, because these treatments can trigger such large placebo responses. So I completely agree that these treatments can help people, but I worry about sending people to therapists who are perhaps using quite unscientific explanations and frameworks for what
Mhm,
they're
mhm.
doing. I mean, what I would love to see is proper funding and proper research and taking these mind-body effects seriously, so that we can use that more in the conventional treatment that we're offering, like you say, not using computers and meeting people's eyes and having longer consultation times. There are studies showing that helps people as well, and having empathic practitioners, and that we do that properly in conventional medicine in an evidence-based way. I don't know how long it's going to be before that happens. So in the meantime, it would be difficult to say to anybody, don't go to an alternative therapist. But I just wanted to sound that note of caution, if you like.
Right. So I hope I'm not putting you on the spot by asking you whether there are any alternative therapies where you've just been unable to find any effectiveness, and where you've said to yourself, this is just a complete scam. No placebo, no nothing. That, this is just not something that people should be spending their money on. Or is it operator dependent?
It will completely depend on the person. So if somebody believes in something, then I think you're likely to have a placebo effect. You've got to be aware of which conditions placebo responses are relevant for. So just belief in something, in a treatment, there's little evidence that that's going to banish an infection or shrink a tumor. It's not going to help a person with diabetes make insulin. It's not going to change cholesterol levels, but they can be very effective for symptoms that we experience, like pain, fatigue, nausea, itching, wheezing, those kinds of things. And through these biological changes that I mentioned, it's not just all in the mind. So there's that. There's also, I think you would want to avoid any therapy that could potentially be dangerous or have side effects. And yeah, I worry about things like homeopathy and Reiki. There's no sort of, from a scientific perspective, there isn't really any evidence or justification for the sort of the energy fields or the memory of water that's invoked, and so that sort of worries me. So yeah, what I'd rather see is that we understand the role that the mind plays on the body, and if we do use these therapies, kind of give ourselves some credit, realize
Mhm.
that that's not acting through some kind of woo crazy immeasurable energy field. It's just it's just helping us to unlock our own self-healing potential, if you see what I mean.
Mhm. Yeah. You know, I wonder though about traditional physicians like myself, even open-minded ones, the extent to which we can enlarge our vocabulary and just concept of what healing is. Um, Specifically, I'll admit that a challenge I have frequently is when a patient comes to me with feedback they've received from an alternative practitioner, which is something that is alien to my understanding of anatomy and physiology. So I not infrequently hear, my immune system doesn't work,
Hmm.
or, my liver needs to be detoxified, or my spine is malaligned. And I feel very conflicted about this, because on the one hand, all I want is for them to get better and to feel better, and whatever works is fine with me as long as it's not dangerous. And, you know, Lord knows there's lots of things that traditional medicine doesn't do a great job fixing. And yet, it's really hard for me to sign on to something that scientifically doesn't make sense to me. And I wonder what you would, having looked at this all very carefully, what you would tell a doctor like me about that dilemma.
I mean, I think you probably have a much deeper perspective on that than I would do, because you're dealing with patients all the time. Whereas I met a lot of patients for the book, and I looked, I spoke to researchers and looked at the scientific study. But having that sort of year in year out experience with patients, I'm sure you've got a lot of experience and stories to tell about that. I mean, I think being completely dismissive of a patient's kind of views and where they're coming from isn't going to be very helpful. But at the same time, I don't think it's right to completely let go of the sort of the scientific framework. To me, it's really important that we do look at things in a rational evidence-based way, and we don't just sort of pander to people's delusions, if you like. In the long run, I don't think that's going to be helpful, but I do think that there's a duty or a responsibility, if you like, on conventional medicine to not just say, well, alternative medicine doesn't work, or we can throw it all out because it's no better than placebo. Like, we need to be taking these mechanisms and pathways seriously, and incorporating that into conventional medicine. At the moment, it's like dismissing alternative medicine and not giving people anything in its place, and so people are left without anything to help them. And drugs aren't often the best way to treat things like chronic pain, for example, or mild to moderate depression. So
Hmm.
I do think that there just needs to be a shift in terms of funding and studying these processes and how people with these conditions can best be helped, so that we do actually have something to offer those people.
Yeah. I know you spoke with Dr. Paul Offit, the infectious disease specialist at Penn, who wrote a book about alternative medicine. I think it was called Do You Believe in Magic? And he says in that book that if a therapy works, it's not alternative. And if it doesn't work, it's not medicine. So, and I wondered, it's an interesting statement, and I wondered what you thought
Mm.
about that.
Well, it depends what he means by works. And if by works he means is better than placebo in trials, I assume that's what that means.
I probably, yeah.
So I think there are just some flaws in the logic there, because, like I said, because you're defining works as does better than placebo in trials, then you're
Mhm.
defining works as in works through the direct biochemical or physical action of a drug or treatment. And that's a very narrow view of medicine. That's just one very small part of medicine. But there are
Mhm.
lots of things that can cause, therapeutic and beneficial physiological changes that are often indistinguishable from the changes caused by drugs, but they're caused through other things like psychological cues. So if you're going to define it by does better than placebo in a trial, you're automatically throwing all of that stuff out. So I completely agree that we need to study stuff scientifically and see in trials that it works. But I don't. I think there's a value judgment when you're talking about whether, Ted Kaptchuk is quite interesting on this. He says that when we brought in placebo-controlled trials, suddenly we were making a value judgment about what kind of medicine was sort of acceptable, if you
Mhm.
like, and what
Mhm.
wasn't. And it's saying that only something that works through a sort of biochemical action of a drug is acceptable and counts, and
Mhm.
nothing else counts. And so
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
medicine we've now ended up with.
Yeah. No, I had never really thought of it that way. That to call something a placebo control trial is in itself, um, you know, an implicit judgment that essentially says we're either going to do something or not do something.
Yeah, and
And
we need
in fact, it may not. That's not always the case.
Yeah, and we need placebo-controlled trials. They're important. Like, we do need to know what the active biochemical effect of the drug is,
Mhm.
but I would argue that we also need to know what the other effects of treatments are. And some treatments work pretty much only through the active biochemical effect of the drug, and other things, like, I don't know, Reiki probably work pretty much through the mind body connection, and a lot of things are in between. I was talking to researchers at Merck, the drug company, and I
Mhm.
was saying to them, have you ever thought about trying to boost the placebo responses associated with your drugs, so that people are getting the active biochemical effect, but you can also take advantage of all these other processes? So,
Mhm.
in terms of, the name you give the drug, or the way you make it look. And they were like, well, we would love to do that, but we can't. There are actually laws against doing that. You can't give a drug a name that implies it's going to have a certain effect. Um,
Because that's considered fraudulent. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it shouldn't be.
you couldn't call a certain pill cure, for example.
Right. Right. Right.
And I think there are very valid reasons for that, but it's like our focus on the sort of biochemical action of drugs means that
Mhm.
we are not able to take advantage of all of these other possible pathways for making people feel better.
Mhm. I wonder, though, whether having alternative and conventional or traditional medicine completely fused is desirable in that I think one nice thing, very nice thing about the rise of alternative medicine is that I think it's enlarged, certainly for patients, for some doctors, our understanding of what health is about, and it's also democratized um, health to some degree. I mean, I, um, I suggest meditation to patients who I can tell you 20 years ago would have thought I was out of my mind, or insulting them or dismissing them. And, uh, you know, I sort of, it feels like a little bit of a check and balance that not everything is under the same umbrella.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting because yeah, I hadn't really thought about it in that way, but I think that you're right that as conventional medicine is kind of narrowed in and focused on yeah one very narrow view of what work means, what medicine is, the fact that we've got alternative medicine means that all of those other possibilities and views about medicine have been kept safe, if you like
Yeah,
so we still have them. And
yeah,
if we didn't have alternative medicine, we would be in a really, really bad place right now, I think.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, I would agree with you on that, I think.
Yeah. So I want to just end by returning back to where we began, which is so there you are with the mums on the playground, and they're talking about. I think you, when we spoke before, you had mentioned amber teething
Yeah.
necklaces. I don't know whether that's a British thing or a new thing. My kids are grown up, so I'm not in touch with teething at the moment. But uh, in some sense, you set out on a journey to understand their use of mind body medicine better. And I wonder if you did and whether those playground conversations have changed.
Um, I, I mean, I think I understand now that when people say that something has worked for them, it probably really has, and they haven't just imagined that there are these real. I mean, I don't know how you define that word, but measurable physical changes that are happening. So that started off as a sort of suspicion at the beginning, like surely there must be something going on here, or people wouldn't be taken in by it. And now I feel like yes, like I've seen the research to show how these things can help people. I guess what I hope I've done with the book, and I guess as more of my friends read it, I'll find out, is to convince them that they don't need to throw out the sort of scientific approach, if you like. I think a lot of them have almost actively turned away from a scientific evidence-based approach from medicine because it's telling them that alternative medicine doesn't work and they know that's not true. They kind of reject everything, and I would love to be able to kind of bring them back to it and show that we can use science to study these things properly.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that point of view because, after all, what is more frustrating for a patient than to have uh, a, an experience that's invalidated, and to feel that something makes you better and to be told by your doctor that no, that can't possibly be, is it's a terrible feeling, and I hope that even if the two fields aren't completely fused, that at least we can move beyond that moment of disconnection. And I want to thank you because I really think that your book is contributing to healing that rift. It certainly has for me.
Thank you. It was so lovely to talk to you.
You too, Joe. Bye.
Bye.